For the latest on the situation on the ground, I'm joined by Irungu Houghton, Amnesty International Kenya Director. Irungu, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Give us an overview of the reported human rights violations during the recent protests in Kenya. Obviously, there have been a number of casualties, injuries and arrests.
Yeah, so it really has been one of the most dramatic 2 weeks, I think, in many years since the mobilization against the taxation bill. As of today, we have about 40 people who have been killed, many of them shot by police officers. We have 361 persons who are nursing injuries, some of them still in hospitals around the country. The youngest of the fatalities was a 12-year-old boy by the name of Kennedy Onyango from the outskirts of Nairobi. And we've seen something about 627 arrests and 32 abductions. And I think the abductions, all of this is worrying, but I think the abductions are what has really perplexed Kenyans. The use of paramilitary and counterterrorism police officers in plain clothes, essentially dragging people from their homes or from their vehicles, and in some cases outside of their church when they were going for worship with their families, and taken to places and held incommunicado without access to lawyers, medical support if they needed it, or contact with their families.
Now who's been behind the demonstrations, if you will? Is it various individuals just coming together? Is it coordinated from one particular point?
Yeah, I mean, the Gen Z protest movement, as it's now called, has defied, I think all, I guess, hierarchical management theories. It considers itself as leaderless or leaderful, in the sense that there is no particular leader, but there is a series of leaders. It is very adept at working through the social media platforms, and in some cases have been able to pull together tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, not just on the streets of Kenya, but really even in these spaces, social media spaces for big debates. And that's where the coordination is largely being directed from. So they would say that they're leaderless. Of course, there are personalities that have become known primarily because they've been arrested. But it is clear that there isn't a central committee, for example, or a national executive committee, as you would expect in many of the social movements that exist across the world.
Irungu, you're in Nairobi, and that's where you're speaking to us from. What is the situation on the ground at the moment?
Well, I think we're on the eve of the next day of protest, and the protest movement have released another 7 days of actions. Tomorrow is the first of those. They are essentially coming out to commemorate those who have been killed by police officers, to offer solidarity with the victims' families, and to call for accountability for the losses that we've seen. And the losses really have been quite saddening in many ways. I think the protests, for example, on Tuesday last week were in many ways were really peaceful up until late afternoon. And I think what we have been calling on the national security agencies is to respect the right to assemble and provide protection for protesters and isolate those that come with different intentions, those that are violent and come to destroy property or to hurt people, but not to clamp down and tear gas and use disproportionate lethal force on peaceful protesters. In many cases, the protests were really accompanied by people with roses, constitutions, and even the Kenyan flag. I don't think we've seen so many Kenyan flags on the streets of Nairobi, for example, in many years.
Irungu, there are a number of issues at play ahead of tomorrow's series of demonstrations. The first, obviously, is what one might term the success of these demonstrations that happened a week ago, as you suggested. And part of that would be because the president has come out and called back that bill. He says he's not signing it, indicative of an understanding of the grievances of those young people and certainly their actions. Over and above that, he's had to pull the plug on a budget to the office of the First Lady. So that's obviously something that's hit home very, very closely. Then there's also media reports that we've picked up where there seems to be a tussle between the Deputy President and the head of the Central Intelligence over who was accountable, who did not pick up on what was impending prior to this event happening. How is all of this going to manifest, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think let me start from where you ended up. I think the broadside from the Deputy President, which was directed at the Director General of the National Intelligence Services, was completely left field. I mean, I think many of us were very surprised with that for a number of reasons. One is that this is a very sensitive office. In many cases, the name of the Director General is never spoken in public. I mean, this is possibly a bit different from South Africa. But many people actually don't even know who the Director General is, and for the Deputy President to come out so vicious, so vocally against the Director General was quite a surprise. I think that story has moved on. I think where we've, as human rights organizations, and as medical practitioners and as journalists and as advocates, we came together today to take stock of last week and issued a statement that basically essentially asked for 3 or 4 things to happen. The first was we noted that the president has first of all began to respond to the demands of the Generation Z movement. But we also noted that rather than a round of national dialogue talks that have been proposed, many of the issues that have been raised, which include things like, for example, rampant corruption, a bloated cabinet, the defunding of essential services, education, health, and food security or agriculture, that these were things that don't need a national dialogue. They simply need the president to use executive orders and work through his cabinet to effect. So I think the first thing is, in order to restore confidence in this young generation, 75% of Kenya's population, what the president could do is continue to take action on some of the statements and some of the demands that the movement has said, and therefore win back the confidence that has just been so eroded over the last few months or so. I think the other thing is to make sure that there are safe corridors for medical practitioners. We've had cases of medical centers, emergency medical centers being attacked by security officers. We've had lists of patients confiscated. We had doctors arrested or abducted for 10 hours last week. And I think we have to say that, the medical practitioners have to be off limits, both by protesters and by police officers. And I think the last thing is essentially we have to see the stopping of use of non-uniformed officers in unmarked vehicles, because that is just causing even more terror and outrage from the protest movement. And actually it's becoming increasingly difficult to work out who is exactly abducting people, whether they're in the protests or from their homes, if they are not uniforms and do not declare that they are police officers that have come with legitimate charges and are proceeding to police stations rather than to spaces that Kenyans do not recognize.
Irungu Houghton, Amnesty International Kenya Director, appreciate your time. And we certainly hope that those demonstrations tomorrow going forward will be peaceful.